11 NFL teams have a current starting quarterback that is different than the quarterback that started for them all the way back in week 1. And that doesn't count teams like Cincinnati, Minnesota, Houston, San Francisco, starting quarterbacks that missed decent amount of time during the regular season, and these teams had to have different starting quarterbacks during the middle of the year. I think it's safe to say that quarterbacks this season have been a huge issue, and maybe that's part of the reason why the product as a whole at the NFL level just feels like it's not that good this season. For the Rams and Seahawks on Thursday Night Football, Matthew Stafford, Sam Darnold. And Matthew Stafford is continuing his MVP candidacy this season. Last week, threw for almost 400 yards and 2 more touchdowns. This week against Seattle, probably going to be a little bit more of a difficult matchup. Seattle is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. So what's going to break this week? Stafford's MVP candidacy or the Seahawks defense? Sam Darnold has had some pretty big inconsistencies this season, especially after their bye week in week 8. Since week 8, he has finished outside the top 24 quarterbacks 4 different times. One of those games was against this same Rams defense, where he finishes the QB 25 and threw 4 interceptions. He has a decently high ceiling at times, but he has also collapsed, something that happened quite often in the second half of last season as well. Philadelphia at Washington, the first game on Saturday, kicking off at 5 o'clock. Jalen Hurts is going to be a must start for us this week. You're obviously going to be playing him if you own him, but you want to be just a little bit concerned about the upside. It's obviously a great matchup. Washington allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But what if this game goes similar to last week? Philadelphia has a huge lead and they start pulling their starter. If that's the case, you could see some limited ceiling from Jalen Hurts, making him more along the lines of a top 10 quarterback instead of a top 5. Jayden Daniels shut down for the rest of the season, so you're not going to find yourself trying to figure out if you should be playing him anymore. And for the rest of the season, I do believe that Marcus Mariota is not worth a shot in the dark. There's been a couple of times this season where he's had a solid matchup. There's been a couple of times where he's looked good. Philadelphia allows the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and based on the performance I saw from him last week, I don't think there's nearly enough upside in this matchup. Green Bay at Chicago, and Jordan Love played great against Chicago just a couple of weeks ago, and I think he could end up playing exactly the same way this week. It would be a huge help if he had Christian Watson, but even with the potential of not having Watson this week, he still has plenty of weapons to finish inside the top 12 quarterbacks. But even if he doesn't showcase that type of upside, he should still have a floor for anywhere between 15 and 12. In each of the last 2 games, Caleb Williams has finished as a QB2 inside the top 24. So we haven't seen his upside in quite a while, because 3 weeks ago he finished as the QB 25. Now this defense for Green Bay is going to look pretty different with no Micah Parsons, and I do believe that there is a higher ceiling for Caleb Williams this week. But because we have not seen it on a consistent basis, if you're playing Caleb Williams, it feels like you're playing him for his floor right now, which again, just like Jordan Love, puts him in that 13 to 15 range. Could he make it inside the top 12 with no Micah Parsons on the other side? Absolutely. Green Bay's defense could still be decently tough though, so you want to be cautious with Williams this week. Before we head into the rest of the slate, I just got to remind everybody, if you are trying to finish up any last minute Christmas shopping, then make sure you include our friends over at Caddy Splash for all the golfers in your life, whether they're a handicap golfer or whether they're a scratch golfer, or maybe they're like me, they're just out there to have a little bit of fun. Caddy Splash would be a perfect Christmas gift. When I head out to the golf course, I want to have some fun. My golf swing doesn't look that great, so I want to make sure that I at least look like a golfer prior to pulling up to the first tee box. And I do that by keeping my golf clubs looking spectacular, and using the products over at Caddy Splash absolutely help me do that. And right now, by using code Headliners15, you can get 15% off of your order over at Caddy Splash. So stuff some stockings, have a couple of golf items under the tree for that person in your life that loves to head out to the golf course when it's warm enough. Here right now, it's not, but I'll make sure that my clubs are looking fantastic once it's time to hit the links again. Buffalo at Cleveland, and yes, Josh Allen has a tougher matchup against Cleveland, who's currently allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and we know Myles Garrett is going for that sack record. But Josh Allen is not the guy that's going to make it the easiest to get that record. Mobile, using his feet, using his legs, getting out of the pocket, running for touchdowns, whatever it may be, including his arm, Josh Allen is a top 5 candidate every week, regardless of the opponent. Shedeur Sanders does not have a great matchup going up against Buffalo, who currently allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, and coming off of a game where he threw 3 interceptions and only 177 yards. This doesn't feel like the best game for him to bounce back. Some of you were trying to run him out there as a streaming option. This week, I wouldn't do that. It's been a while since we've gotten a top 12 performance out of Justin Herbert, but we have seen that injury to his left hand and the surgery that he had hasn't really kept him from still being fantasy viable. Right now, Justin Herbert has been much better as a QB2 than a QB1, but this week he gets a matchup against Dallas, who still allows the most fantasy points per game, so Justin Herbert will be a start for me. Before last week, Dak Prescott had 4 straight games inside the top 10 quarterbacks. This matchup against the Chargers, allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game, they've caused some troubles over the last couple of weeks for Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts. So Dak Prescott could also have some trouble as well. But the one thing that we can probably bet on in this matchup, Dak Prescott's going to throw the ball an awful lot. Volume sometimes is better than nothing. Will we see Minshew mania, or is it going to be a total dud? Gardner Minshew starting this week for the Kansas City Chiefs in place of the injured Patrick Mahomes. And his matchup against Tennessee, who currently allows the 7th most fantasy points per game, definitely is a solid matchup. But honestly, we're talking about a guy that hasn't played all season long, doesn't get starter reps, and has really just been chilling because Patrick Mahomes has been the guy. So is Gardner Minshew ready to step in the fantasy playoffs? I'm not ready for him to step in. I think you got to give Cam Ward some props. He has not thrown an interception since week 8. He has 2 touchdowns in each of the last 2 games, and he's looking like a much more complete quarterback than he did at the beginning of the year. Kudos to this coaching staff after they took over and kind of saw things throughout the rest of the season to really help keep developing Cam Ward. It doesn't make him fantasy viable still. Not a ton of volume, not a ton of yards. Even if he throws a couple of touchdowns, he's barely going to make his way into the top 12. Cincinnati at Miami, and the Dolphins are allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. This is the perfect opportunity for Joe Burrow to bounce back, which is exactly what you need this week. Burrow was terrible last week, and maybe that had something to do with all the controversy over his comments, how he wasn't having fun. Some things that just led people to believe that a lot like Andrew Luck, he could end up hanging it up a lot earlier than what he should. But this week against Miami, I think he can bounce back and get back to having some fun. Right before I started recording this video, it was announced that Quinn Ewers would take over at quarterback and Tua would be benched for the remainder of the season. This is a solid matchup for Quinn Ewers to get back out there and try to see exactly what the Dolphins have in him. The Bengals are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But even with a better matchup, how do you feel like starting Quinn Ewers in your fantasy championship roster over the next week or 2? Probably not great. I'm not risking it here. The Saints defense is really coming on strong here at the end of the season, and right now they're allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. And we don't know who's going to be starting for the Jets this week. Is it going to be Justin Fields or Tyrod Taylor, who both have been injured? Or is it going to be Brady Cook, who just threw 3 interceptions? Whoever it is, they're not in my starting lineup. The Jets are currently allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and they are on track to force the fewest turnovers for any defense in a long time. I believe, if I read correctly, since basically the NFL began at the merger. So for me, Tyler Shuck, he's a fringe start this week. We've seen some decent things out of him. Do I want to start him in a 1 QB league? No, but in a Superflex or a 2 quarterback league, I think he's a great fit as your QB2. Should JJ McCarthy be in green? If you wanted him there, I wouldn't argue against it. And I actually originally had placed him there. It's a solid matchup against the Giants, allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. He's also been the QB10 and the QB7 over the last couple of weeks. 413 passing yards and 6 total touchdowns combined during those 2 games. JJ McCarthy could absolutely have another fantastic day against the Giants. However, because his track record this year hasn't been great, I will take a step back. I'll try to lower expectations a little bit and just list him as a fringe start instead. But if you're somebody that's been dealing with issues and you need a quarterback in a 1 QB league, JJ McCarthy, who potentially is on waivers, would be one of my top candidates to pick up and play. Jackson Dart may have his hands more full than JJ McCarthy this week, as Dart is getting a Minnesota defense that currently allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. But the one thing that we've seen since Dart came back from concussion, he's not afraid to run the ball still. That was a big concern about whether or not he would still get out of the pocket and move. Now, could he put himself in a position to not take nearly as big of hits? Absolutely, and I think he'll get better at that. But because he's not afraid to run on the ground, he still has top 12 upside regardless of the matchup. Carolina is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and Baker has not been a top 12 quarterback in 4 straight games now. Baker Mayfield this week seems more like he's a top 15 to 13 play and not a top 12 play. In a 1 QB league, you might be in a position where you need to roll with him, and I would roll with him over other streaming options that you may grab off the waiver wire. But if you do that, you just have to know that this matchup could be a little bit more tougher for him, given the fact that he hasn't been that great recently anyway. The Tampa Bay Bucks are allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, so Bryce Young is in a smash position this week, and we have seen upside from him this season. That's why he is a fringe start. But he can't be a start even in a game like this because, again, the consistency just isn't there. He'll have a big game and then he'll disappear for a while. He'll have a big game and then he'll disappear. This could be one of those big games. Trevor Lawrence has been on absolute fire. His matchup this week is not great. The Denver Broncos are allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but that doesn't mean that Trevor Lawrence still can't be good and still isn't fantasy viable. We probably just need to lower expectations. Yes, he's been a top 12 quarterback in 4 straight games, and during this time frame, he has 9 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Because of that, I think Trevor Lawrence is a guy that you could continue to roll with. Just know his upside isn't what we saw last week. Kind of the same thing goes for Bo Nix. He had a big week last week, but unfortunately he hasn't been anywhere near as consistent as what Trevor Lawrence has been over the last few weeks. And that's why I can't sit here and say that Bo Nix is a safe start this week either. This was the first time since week 9 that he had multiple touchdown passes in a game. And if you're only getting 1 touchdown pass from your quarterback and he has turnover potential, he's not making it into the top 12 nearly enough. Kirk Cousins decided to be a Hall of Fame quarterback last week against Tampa Bay. And the matchup this week against Arizona, it isn't tough by any means, but it's not necessarily as easy as what we saw last week. Kirk Cousins this season hasn't been anywhere near what we saw from him last week, so even if we think that he's due heating up, once again, he is one of those quarterback streaming options that I'm not super excited about. Would I play him if I need to? Yeah, I don't hate the matchup, but I look at him more as a streaming option for 2 quarterback or super flex leagues. If you're in a 1 QB league and you needed a streamer, I'd rather take JJ McCarthy than Kirk Cousins. Even though we had a really tough matchup last week, Jacoby Brissett still finished as a top 12 quarterback. Once again, he now has 6 straight games with 40 or more passing attempts. He may be one of the safest quarterbacks in all of fantasy football right now, and that's based off the volume alone. Pittsburgh at Detroit, Matthew Stafford, he struggled a little bit in the first half against the Lions, but in the second half, looked like an MVP candidate once again. The Lions are missing 3 key players in their secondary right now, and their defensive line has been causing a little bit more pressure, but it's still really tough to get after a guy like Aaron Rodgers, especially when you have a weapon like DK Metcalf. Aaron Rodgers is going to be a start for me this week. The Lions are still allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. And Jared Goff was the opposite. Last week he threw for 338 yards and 3 touchdowns, but a majority of that production came in the first half. And then in the second half, he completely disappeared. Not all his fault. His offensive line was terrible in the second half. And maybe they struggle again this week against the Steelers. We'll see if TJ Watt is able to go. But the Steelers are still allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which gives Jared Goff a super high ceiling this week, considering it's at home. It doesn't matter if it's Geno Smith. It doesn't matter if it's Kenny Pickett. Pickett only threw for 64 yards last week. And now they get the Houston Texans allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. I'm not even looking at either of these guys. This is a solid matchup for CJ Stroud, and I think he's got top 12 potential this week. He had 3 passing touchdowns last week. He has 260 or more passing yards in 2 of the last 3 games, and Las Vegas is exactly the type of matchup where you could keep up those type of numbers and really not have to worry about too many turnovers. New England at Baltimore, Sunday Night Football, an MVP candidate this year with Drake May going against an MVP candidate for the last several years, Lamar Jackson. And Drake May wasn't great through the air last week, but he added 2 rushing touchdowns, utilizing his legs, something that we know he can do. He just hasn't had to do it as much as of recent. Going up against Baltimore this week, even with some of that down performance from last week, I still think he jumps back into the top 12 conversation against Baltimore. You gotta play Lamar Jackson, but it doesn't feel great. My son is playing fantasy football for the first time this season, and luckily enough, he ended up making it as the #1 seed all the way to the fantasy championship. Lamar Jackson is his quarterback, and he sweats it every single week since about the halfway point of the season. However, he gets to run into dad this week. I'm 2-0 against him in the regular season. We'll see if I can continue to show little swag who the teacher is. San Francisco at Indianapolis. Brock Purdy definitely has looked solid, and this defense with no Sauce Gardner does not look nearly as daunting as what we did right after that trade. So for me and Brock Purdy this week, I think he's a super safe bet with top 12 upside, and 1 QB leagues, if he's your starter, I would absolutely feel fine rolling with him. For Phillip Rivers, he didn't look awful last week, but I'm still not going to risk it with a 44-year-old guy coming out of retirement in my fantasy playoffs. You can find better streaming options. Headliner Nation, hopefully you've appreciated all of the start and sit videos, and if you have, please do me a big favor. Interact with this video and the other videos in any way, shape, or form that you find the ability to do so. Whether it's liking the video, subscribing if you're new, turning on the bell notifications, leaving a comment, hyping the video, it doesn't matter. Just help us show YouTube that we are one of the best fantasy communities in all of YouTube by interacting with the video. Hopefully everybody stays safe and healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.